20 September 1999. Dili, East Timor. The first Australian stepped into a city that smelled of salt, diesel, burnt timber, and fresh ash. Smoke still curled over the port. Indonesian troops were still in the territory. The militias had not gone far, and buried later in UN resolutions, declassified cables, and official histories was the question that makes this story unforgettable. When East Timor began burning in full view of the world, why was Australia the one expected to go in first? Because this was not just another peacekeeping mission. If Australia failed, civilians would keep dying. If Australia hesitated, the killings would spread. And if one nervous soldier pulled a trigger at the wrong roadblock, it could become a direct clash with Indonesia, the giant to Australia's north. That is what made the message, and stripped of diplomacy, so brutal. Bring me the Australians. And if you think Australia only enters wars designed by bigger powers, stay with this one. Because in the space of a few September nights, Canberra was pushed toward a mission no one really wanted to own, in a city already half destroyed, with the whole region holding its breath. To understand how that happened, you have to go back before the landing, back before the ash, before the armored vehicles, before the relief flights and the handshakes and the carefully worded speeches about peace. You have to go back to a vote. On August 30th, 1999, nearly the entire East Timorese electorate turned out to decide their future. Under a UN-run popular consultation, they were asked whether they would accept autonomy inside Indonesia or begin the path toward independence. And almost 98% voted. And when the result was announced on September 4th, the answer was overwhelming. More than 78% rejected autonomy. They had chosen freedom, and for that, they were punished almost immediately. Pro-integration militias, many armed and backed by elements of the Indonesian security apparatus, unleashed a campaign of murder, arson, looting, forced displacement, and terror. Houses burned. Churches filled with the desperate. Families vanished into the hills. The streets of Dili became a geography of fear. The world saw the smoke. What it did not see at first was the hesitation behind closed doors. For years, Australia had walked carefully around East Timor. Successive governments had balanced principle against geography, morality against the need to manage Indonesia. Even in 1999, as the crisis built, Canberra was not charging eagerly toward intervention. Later reporting and official history would make that painfully clear, which makes the next part even stranger. Because when the killing surged, the same Australia that had not wanted this crisis suddenly had to prepare to lead the force that would walk into it. Not America, not Britain, not NATO. And that matters, because the phrase people remember now can be misleading. This was not a NATO operation. It was more exposed than that. A UN-authorized multinational force, built in a hurry, entering a territory where the local security structure had collapsed, the militias were armed, and the Indonesian military still had men, weapons, and pride on the ground. That meant there was no comfortable shield, only responsibility. And the responsibility kept getting heavier by the hour. In early September, East Timor was collapsing in public. Reports described people being driven from their homes, towns being emptied, and columns of refugees forced westward. Intelligence pointed to what many already suspected. This was not random chaos. This was organized violence moving under the cover of plausible deniability. The streets were loud with gunfire, engines, shouting, and breaking glass. Then suddenly, silent. That silence was worse, because silence in a terrorized city means people are hiding, waiting, listening for boots at the door, wondering if the next fire is theirs. Inside Australia, public outrage rose fast. International pressure did too, but outrage is not logistics. Anger does not conjure a landing force. And that is where the real tension begins in this story. And because Australia was being pushed toward a mission it had not fully prepared to lead. Even as intervention became more likely, there were shortages, equipment gaps, rushed planning, borrowed body armor, strict water rations, tight food arrangements. A force was being assembled not in the comfort of long preparation, but in the heat of sudden necessity, and still the bigger question remained unanswered. Would Indonesia actually let them in? That was the knife edge, because no UN resolution mattered if Indonesian consent did not come, or if it came too late, or if it came with one hand while the other still armed the militias. And for several terrible days, that uncertainty hung over everything. Diplomats talked, militias burned, UN staff tried to hold on, and East Timor kept bleeding. And then Washington entered the story more forcefully. Years later, declassified reporting would underline something uncomfortable for Australia's preferred national memory. It was American pressure on Jakarta that proved decisive in cracking the deadlock. The United States did not want to send ground troops. Howard would later resent that. But when it came time to force the issue with Indonesia's leadership, American weight mattered. On September 8th, Admiral Dennis Blair, commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, met Indonesian commander Wiranto. The message was cold, direct, and unmistakable. The world was watching. Indonesia's relationship with the world was being destroyed in real time. The window to salvage it was closing. That was not a threat shouted across a table, it was something more effective. At a great power reminding another military exactly how alone it could become. And suddenly the question shifted. Not whether an international force would go, but who would lead it. The answer, in effect, was Australia. That was the brutal simplicity underneath all the diplomatic language. The Americans would pressure, but not land. Others would contribute, but not take command. The UN would authorize, but it had no army of its own standing ready at the pier. So the country nearest the fire, the country with the regional stake, the country with the troops and the political nerve to move first, was told to step forward. Bring me the Australians. On September 12th, Indonesia agreed to accept international assistance. On September 15th, the UN Security Council authorized the multinational force under a unified command structure headed by Australia. 5 days later, the first Australians arrived in Dili. 5 days. That is almost nothing. Enough time to load ships, check weapons, issue maps, repeat warnings, brief rules of engagement, and stare at the ceiling in the dark, wondering whether this was peacekeeping or the opening of a war. Because the men going in knew something politicians rarely say out loud. You can call it peacekeeping all you like, but if the other side decides to fight, the name changes instantly. Major General Peter Cosgrove would command the force, and the burden on him was extraordinary. And he had to move fast enough to seize the initiative, calm enough not to provoke Indonesia, and hard enough to convince every militia leader in East Timor that the permissive days were over. Too soft, and the killings continued. Too aggressive, and the operation risked a wider conflict. There is no manual for that kind of balance, only instinct, pressure, judgment, and thousands of armed men depending on it. The landing itself has often been remembered as clean and orderly. In one sense, it was. Interfet entered Dili and quickly established control over key ground. But clean on paper is not the same as calm in the body. Imagine stepping off into humid air so thick it feels drinkable. Imagine the smell first. Burnt plastic, rotting food, smoke trapped in the heat. Imagine not knowing whether the building ahead is empty or watched. Imagine seeing civilians wave 1 second and seeing armed men stare back the next. That was the atmosphere. Australian veterans later remembered the sight and smell above all else. Some described devastation everywhere. One account recalled the port like a scene from Hades, and that image fits, because Dili was not merely damaged, it looked scorched, stripped, violated. This is where the story becomes more than strategy, because operations are remembered through the senses. The sweat under body armor, the metallic taste of adrenaline, the constant scan of windows, alleys, rooftops, the tiny calculations a soldier makes without words, that parked truck, that sudden movement, that silence. And behind the tactical maps sat another danger. The Indonesians had not vanished. Their forces were withdrawing, but they were still present during the early phase. At times, interfet units faced tense standoffs with Indonesian troops. That made every convoy, every checkpoint, every moment of confusion potentially explosive. Both sides were armed. Both were proud. Both knew the political consequences of a firefight would be enormous. So the Australians had to project dominance without triggering catastrophe. That is far harder than charging. Charging is simple. Control is hard. In the first days, Interfet moved to secure Dili, protect key infrastructure, and create enough order for humanitarian relief to function. But even that tidy sentence hides the human chaos underneath. Civilians were traumatized. Entire neighborhoods had been torched. The normal rhythms of life had been shattered, and across the territory. Yet militia elements were still active or dispersing. So the mission kept widening. Secure the city, then the roads, then the approaches, then the hinterland, then the enclaves, then the borderline, then the refugees, then the aid corridors, then the next rumor, and the next one. This is how operations become exhausting. Not because the first objective is impossible, but because success reveals 10 more problems hiding behind it. Interfet eventually grew into a 22-nation force with nearly 11,500 personnel, including around 5,500 Australians. That scale tells you something important. This was not a token deployment. It was the largest deployment of Australian troops since the Second World War. Australia was not just contributing to someone else's mission. Australia was the mission's spine. But scale creates vulnerability too. A force that size needs ships, aircraft, fuel, food, water, intelligence, communications, medical support, engineering, and political patience. It needs the sea lanes open and the air bridge running. It needs allies to keep believing. It needs commanders to sleep very little and think very clearly. And it needs luck. Every commander hates admitting that, but luck is always there. Luck that a frightened conscript does not open fire. Luck that a militia commander decides to melt away instead of make a last stand. Luck that a rumor of ambush is only a rumor. Luck that your own haste has not hidden some fatal oversight. The Australians had courage. They had discipline. They had momentum. But they also needed luck. And for several weeks, the entire operation balanced on whether moral authority could stay ahead of armed resistance. But Interfet's real genius was not theatrical battle. It was dominance without descent into general war. The force moved decisively enough to end the psychological momentum of the militias. Once armed men understand that the era of easy killing is over, many discover other appointments elsewhere. That shift is invisible until it happens. One day, terror belongs to the gunmen. The next, it belongs to them. That reversal is everything. Australian and Allied forces pushed out from Dili to places like Liquica, Suai, and the Oakusi enclave. They disarmed where they could, deterred where they had to, liaised with Falintal, and built the conditions for a larger UN transition. The mission's UN mandate was to restore peace and security, protect and support the UN presence, and facilitate humanitarian assistance. Simple words, heavy work. And because in reality, humanitarian assistance in a broken territory means trying to make order appear before panic spreads faster than trucks can move. It means children who have not slept properly in days, families trying to find the missing, priests, aid workers, nurses, and soldiers operating inside the same field of trauma, and all the while the old mystery kept returning. Why Australia? Why, when so much of the diplomatic groundwork had been hesitant, did the burden land here? Part of the answer is geography. East Timor lay in Australia's neighborhood, not Europe's. Part of it was military practicality. Australia had the ability to move forces from Darwin and shoulder command. Part of it was politics. Once American pressure made Indonesian acceptance possible, someone still had to do the dangerous part. And in the dangerous part was always going to belong to the country willing to own the consequences. That was Australia. Not because it had been the purest champion from the beginning. Not because history was simple, but because history rarely rewards purity. It rewards whoever is standing on the tarmac when the final call comes. That is what makes this story so uncomfortable and so compelling at the same time. The soldiers performed brilliantly in a mission that politics had approached uncertainly. The military achievement was real. So was the political hesitation that preceded it. Both things can be true, and in serious history, they usually are. The mythology likes cleaner lines. It likes a nation that saw evil, made a noble choice, and marched without doubt. But the archival record is less flattering and therefore more interesting. Australia did not stride into 1999 as an eager liberator. It was pushed by events, by outrage, by Allied pressure, and by the speed of a humanitarian collapse. Then, once committed, it moved with remarkable professionalism. That combination matters, because it reveals something central about Australian power. Australia often looks most decisive not at the beginning of a crisis, but at the moment when the ambiguity is over and someone still has to go. That is when rhetoric falls away. That is when geography hardens into duty. That is when the question stops being what would be ideal and becomes who is actually boarding the aircraft. And in September 1999, that answer was young Australians in body armor, sweating through tropical heat, yet walking into a city that had just been broken. Some were career soldiers, some were barely old enough to have shed their civilian lives. They came from towns and suburbs far from Dili, from places where September meant something utterly ordinary. Then suddenly, they were in a half-burned capital, trying to prevent a massacre from becoming a memory the world would politely regret. That human gap is easy to miss. The distance between strategic language and what a private feels in his hands. The distance between restore stability and stepping into a street where someone was murdered last week. The distance between multinational force and a young soldier hearing an unfamiliar language through a cracked doorway and wondering whether it is fear or threat. This is why missions like Interfet stay in the bloodstream of a military long after medals are boxed away. Because they are intimate, not abstract. They ask soldiers to do something psychologically difficult, to be visibly stronger than the men around them, while using that strength as rarely as possible. To absorb uncertainty without transmitting it. To carry violence in reserve and let presence do the work. And in East Timor, presence did the work. Gradually, the militias lost the initiative. Dili stabilized. Key areas were secured. Humanitarian operations expanded. By February 2000, responsibility would pass from Interfet to the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor. The territory would continue along the long, uneven road toward independence which finally came in 2002. So, yes, in military terms, the operation was a success, a striking one. Interfet ended militia violence, stabilized the territory, and did so without sliding into a full military rupture with Indonesia. For Australia, it became proof that the country could lead a major operation in its own region, under a UN mandate, with multinational partners, and without hiding behind someone else's command structure. But the deepest lesson is not triumph. It is honesty. Because East Timor forces a harder question than patriotic memory usually permits. What do we make of a nation that hesitated politically, then acted decisively militarily? What do we call a mission that was morally necessary, operationally brilliant, and diplomatically more compromised than the legend prefers? We call it real, and real history is always stronger than myth. The myth says Australia was born for this moment. The reality says Australia was cornered into it, scrambled for it, carried it, and then proved equal to it. That is more impressive, because perfection is easy to admire from a distance. What matters is what a country does after delay, after miscalculation, after the comfortable options are gone. When East Timor burned, the world produced statements, pressure, and resolutions. Australia produced the force that landed. That is why this mission still echoes. Not because it was clean, not because it was simple, but because when the smoke was thick, the rules uncertain, and the consequences potentially enormous, the question became brutally practical. Who is actually going? And the answer came back in boots, ships, aircraft, sweat, and nerve. The Australians. If you want more untold military stories like this, subscribe to Australia's Secret Wars.